Everyone. My name is Bhupinder Singh. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Division of Plant Sciences at the University of Missouri and also a member of this symposium committee. I'm here to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Sara Lira. Dr. Lira is a research scientist at Corteva Agriscience in the Dallas Center, Iowa. She received a bachelor's in ecology and master's in genetics and PhD in plant breeding from Iowa State University. Dr. Lira spent 10 years as a corn breeder at Corteva, but has recently turned her focus towards breeding for emerging climate-positive cropping systems. Her work has lately been emphasized on the development of peas, which could be used as a short-season protein crop and a nitrogen source in a non-traditional pea growing regions. Today, she will share her ideas on the topic breeding for climate positive cropping systems, a pea case study. If there are any questions from the audience, kindly use the chat options. Let's welcome Dr. Lira for her talk.
Hi, everybody. Can you guys see my screen just fine and hear me? Is everything okay?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, super. Let me get moving. So I'll just start out by thanking a few people. So it's a big, long list of people. They're not all on the screen, but especially want to thank my mentors. And so for you guys, I'm 45 and I still have mentors as a scientist. So Charlie Messina and Kevin McPhee have been my mentors on this project, and they've been just, wonderful to help with this and support me through this. And then I also want to call out especially the guys that help us in the field, Adam Walters and Mark Charlotte in particular. They're the ones who make all of this field work happen. We have a couple of graduate students who have been helping us from Iowa State and NC State on our work. And then especially at the bottom, I have a list of growers who have helped us, and they make this possible. So if they weren't willing to try wild things, we wouldn't be able to do our research. So they've been instrumental in loaning us our farm, but also, loaning us their brains. So thanks to all of those guys. So today I want to start out talking about a shift from breeding crops to breeding for cropping systems and what that requires, both in your brain and also in your infrastructure. Then I'll talk about kind of practical matters. Why are peas a good solution for cropping systems? Some details on pea production and agronomy, and then I'll touch on a little bit of pea breeding. So I'll just start out by setting the scene for maybe why we started going down this road in the first place at Corteva. So the first thing is that everybody knows our climate is starting to look different. So on the farm, we're finding that our growers are having more intense rain events, which makes it harder for them to get in the field. And if they do get in the field timely and have a good crop, it's pretty hard to keep that crop standing through more intense storms that we have through the season. And then in addition, we have hotter nights and drier days and a lot more potential for drought in the future. And in some cases, more drought right now. And we all know that hotter conditions are not great for plant growth, right? So climate change is changing the experience of farming now, and it will do so even more so in the future. The other thing that's happening in the background is for our growers is that the market is tough. So farmers are operating on razor thin margins in commodity crops, and this is leading to bankruptcies. So bankruptcies for our growers are getting higher and higher. So it's really hard to farm right now economically. And it doesn't look like there's going to be much improvement in the future if we just keep doing what we've already been doing for all these years. So then off the farm, what we're finding is there's some other things happening sort of societally that are influencing the way our growers have to operate. So water quality is a concern across the Midwest, especially. It's important for local drinking water supplies, but also for, lots of downstream things. I'm not telling anybody anything that they don't know, but there's data there that says that people are upset about this and should be upset about it. And that, we're thinking of ways as a government and state and at the state and federal level of how to deal with that. So one of the things we'd like to do is help our growers do a better job. And along the same lines, there's some social pressure in the space for climate change. And a lot of this is talking about carbon sequestration and managing climate through carbon sequestration. So you can see lots of Federal funding, lots. And I know you guys are receiving federal funding at the university, so that probably comes out bad. But there is federal funding, decent federal funding focused on sort of climate change mitigation research and agriculture. And then there's a lot happening in the business world. Big companies are making pledges to be carbon neutral, and the way that they execute on that is going to vary. And our goal is to help our growers be in the market for producing products that have a carbon neutral production system, right? So for Pepsi, for example, we'd like our growers to be able to sell products that they can process that have a carbon neutral label on them. But also we'd like our growers to be able to just get in the carbon credit market with their farming practices, not necessarily with their actual products. And we think there's even more federal funding going to come in this space, federal and state funding. So the government is involved in a couple ways, and then private industry is involved. So this is a real change that we feel like is coming socially. And then a final social thing that's happening is the interest in plant-based proteins. And so the demand is on the rise. I'm sure you guys saw the shortage of plant protein for, sorry guys, Beyond Meat, products like that. They were running out of supply basically. So there's a lot of interest in this from the public, and there's lots of companies that are kind of getting in the business of addressing that interest. And then just in general, never minding alternative plant proteins, there's just a general need for global protein. So there's going to be more protein consumption across the globe, whether that protein goes straight from a plant into a person, or if it stops off in an animal on its way to a person. The fact is we need more plant proteins in the world and in agricultural production. So we sat down and thought about all of these things that are kind of happening and said, how can we address this as an agricultural company? And we came up with a mission statement, and it is that we can restore profitability and sustainability to the farm with cropping systems that incorporate new market opportunities, climate mitigation efforts, and the concept of circular economies. And so I just want to call out two particular phrases in here and discuss them a little bit, because it took me some time to get my brain around them. So what is a cropping system? And in this case, we're defining a cropping system as the crop inputs, the sequence of crops, and the management of those crops on a farm over a period of years. And so we have cropping systems right now, right? A corn bean rotation in the Midwest and all the management of that is a cropping system, right? And so we're saying what other cropping systems might exist. The other point I wanted to make here is about circular economies. So what is a circular economy? And what a circular economy is a way of thinking about a system, a production system, and reducing waste in that production system. So instead of a process of produce, consume, discard, right, which is what we do now, we think more about produce, consume, and recycle. And it's not perfect, right? It doesn't mean it's necessarily a closed system, certainly not right out the start. But if we can do more recycling of the components of a cropping system inside that system, the better off we will be. So these were our two goals for our project. And so when you think of a cropping system as a circular economy, the first thing you have to think about is what is the waste that we're trying to design out of those systems. And so there are major sources of waste include light. So there's lots of light that goes onto a farm field that is not collected by plants. Primarily, this is happening at the beginning and the end of a season. So, before you plant your corn or soybeans and after you harvest it, there's still light out there that could be harvested by a plant. Water, same thing. We have water that, we have too much water. We have water sort of flowing outside of the growing season. And then we have, the idea of waste of plant use of water. So maybe you have a plant that isn't optimizing its use of water. Soil is another one, and that one kind of looks like light in that we're not using our soil the most efficiently at the beginning and the end of the season, and sometimes in the middle of the season we're not using all of our soil so efficiently. And then of course you have leaching and erosion, which are obviously wastes of soil. out of the system. And then finally nitrogen, and this is mostly a case like our soil erosion, where you're adding nitrogen in, however you're adding it, whether it's synthetic nitrogen or natural nitrogen, and then not using it and letting it run off or dissolve. So these are kind of the things we think about when we think about designing a cropping system in this context. And so when you think about the goals of our project and the idea of a cropping system as a circular economy, peas have a really nice fit. And the reason is because they have a short growing season. So they allow for production on one side or the other of them in the field. They have overwintering potential. So they use that light soil and water resource on the flanks of the season for a traditional corn soybean rotation. The other thing is that they fix nitrogen. So you're not using, so you're not using synthetic nitrogen. They address the economic concerns through the fact that they're high protein. So it's a new and growing market. It has utility in human food or in livestock rations. And then I put this on here as a plant breeder, right? So I don't know that the circular economy cares about whether this crop is easy to breed, but I do. So peas are diploid and they have a pretty robust genetic resource. And so, when you think about jumping into breeding a new crop, peas are a great candidate for us because they have some infrastructure and they're not super complicated genetically. So considering all of that, we decided to investigate what peas might look like in the Midwest. So I'm going to start just by talking a little bit about grain pea production basics. And so the deal with peas is that they're mostly grown up here in the northwest of the United States, and then of course up in Canada, which I don't show on this map. So this is where they're grown. When they first started growing peas, they needed an inoculant. They don't need it anymore, right? That has become native to the soils in the Northwest. But when we come down into the Midwest to produce, we're going to have to make sure that we inoculate. So that's something we had to consider for our first year of pea production. Peas get drilled on 7.5-inch rows, so they need really close spacing. And the reason is because they have some leaves, but they have a lot of tendrils and pretty soft stems. And so what the peas like to do is grab onto each other and wrap their tendrils around each other. And what that helps them do is grow taller and healthier. And it also makes it possible for us to harvest them without swathing. So it's a production strategy. And to make that happen, you have to drill them on these tight rows in a really high planting population. Herbicide management, it's again on these tight rows. So once the peas get established, the weeds stay mostly under control, but you really do need a good pre-emerge because they are slow out of the ground, just like any legume is. They need roughly the same kind of fertility that a soybean needs. So if you want high pea yields, you do have to manage your P and K. When it comes time to harvest, you harvest at about the same percent moisture as you would a soybean. And so when we considered all of these factors of pea production, we said these look like soybeans in some ways, but they are new in other ways. And so we kind of got new equipment to get the planting done, and we got our inoculant, and we jacked up our population to a really big number that seemed really surprising. We managed to get them planted in the end of March and beginning of April in 2019. And we let them grow, and we said, what's going to happen? And what we found was that they made respectable yields in 2019. So we had one location and just a couple of varieties in strip trials. We invited a breeder from Montana to come out and look at our plots and say, does this look like a pea plot, or does it, look just sick and terrible? And he felt pretty positive about it. And so after one location in 1 year, we said, this seems promising. And so let's think more about, what the system would look like and whether or not we want to invest in these peas. And so this slide kind of represents our thoughts on what the system might look like. So these peas are planted in the Midwest, kind of in the end of March, beginning of April. And that means that they get harvested kind of end of June, beginning of July, and that leaves a lot of growing season after them. And so we have kind of three ideas of what you might fill that growing season with. And one was a service crop or a cover crop. And so that's a benefit here, because most of the time when our growers of corn and soybeans plant a cover crop, it's going on really late in the year, and you just don't get very much growth on those in the fall, or frankly in the spring. And so they really don't get a chance to do much of all of the good things that they do. So if you could get them planted earlier, there could really be some benefit there. The other idea we had was planting some kind of a biomass crop, whether it is summer forage for livestock, and we had some ideas of what those species might look like, or a potential biofuel stock, right? So that market doesn't exist, but it's out there as a candidate. And so for both of these ideas of either a service crop or a biomass crop, there's also an opportunity to leverage the value it's bringing you on the farm beyond the farm to selling carbon credits or nitrogen credits, for example. And then the final option that we thought of for this system, and this is sort of the holy grail for the system, is a double crop. And right now that's a bit tough. We're going to try some really short season beans and see if those work. But that would be our ultimate goal, is to keep continuous cover, but actually have in both cases those crops making a grain that could be marketed. So once we figured out what this might look like, then we said, okay, 1 year in one location is not enough to decide to embark on a project. So in 2020, we established about 12 locations of peas across Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois. And we managed to harvest 9 of those locations at the end, and made an average yield of 39 bushels to the acre. And the honest truth is that I was pretty bummed out by 39 bushels to the acre. So our normal soybean yields, especially in Iowa, are significantly higher than that, right? They get closer to 55 or 60 bushels, and so I was kind of bummed out. But then I looked at the average yield in the traditional pea growing areas, and I realized that we're really in the ballpark with Montana and North Dakota, and we're actually not so far off from Canada. And so given that we didn't know what we were doing, and we have done no breeding or variety selection, we were pretty bad at agronomy last year. That number is actually, it's kind of okay. And it seems like there's a lot of potential there. And so what we decided to do is kind of figure out what we did wrong agronomically last year, and move to the 2021 season with the knowledge that we gained. And so this is what I'm kind of showing in this chart. So we have a range of varieties and yields across all of our locations. And then I've called out the max yield of each variety at a particular location and a particular part of the field, right? So there is some variety selection and optimization of variety to environment that's available out there. We just need to figure out how to do it. And then we've got yields that are more competitive with the soybean yield. The other thing that you'll see is on this last column in this table is our planting population. Sorry, our planting population was 340,000 plants per acre. This was our final population after planting. And you'll see that those numbers aren't even close to 350,000. And the reason is because we went into quite a lot of no-till environments. And what was happening is the peas were getting wrapped up in the corn residue and not germinating. So stalk tucking was happening, poor seed to soil contact. And peas have never encountered this. Corn residue is not a thing that Montana really has a lot of. And so what we realized is, there's some things we can do agronomically to try to address this. So one would be kind of some equipment modifications, more aggressive no-till system. Another would be to maybe try some seed treatments. Maybe we can get better stands with seed treatments. And so that's what we're going to try for this year. Is we've made some modifications to our planting strategy, and hopefully that agronomy will get us some better stands. So basically, the conclusion of all of that is we said we can figure out the agronomy, and if we do, we think these peas can be a competitive crop and bring a lot of value in this idea of a cropping system. And so then we sort of have embarked on a pea breeding research program. And I've just got a few things about peas in here that describe, what it's like to start a pea breeding program from scratch. And I remember this question on my prelims. Someone asked the question, you are starting a new breeding program for a new crop. What are the things that you need to consider when you're planning that program? And I, at the time, was like, this is the most unrealistic prelim question. This would never happen to a person in real life, but it's happened to me. And so these are the things we considered. So there's a lot of genetic resources here for pea in existence that have been developed in the public. They've done a really great job. It has a model species, has a reference genome. We have some major genes that have been identified already. We have a relatively diverse pool of germplasm still remaining. We have a nice set of accessions available in GRIN to use in our breeding program. And we have great opportunities to work with a pea breeding consortium that has started here in the US over the last couple of years. And so, just thinking about breeding, I think there's a lot of opportunity here. And so we decided to move forward with it. And so based on our experiences in 2020 and this goal of breeding, we have to declare what our breeding targets are. And so after 1 year, so that's really important, guys. Remember, this is 1 year of information. What we know is that powdery mildew is going to be a target. So this picture on the left shows a resistant pea variety and then a susceptible pea variety, and they look quite different, right? And the pea breeders, what they tell us is that powdery mildew can sometimes have an effect on yield and sometimes not. If it comes in late enough, all it does is makes the pod rubbery and hard to harvest, so it won't dry down evenly. But it doesn't necessarily reduce your amount of yield. But if it comes in early enough, it can reduce yield. And I believe that in our trials, it most likely did reduce yield. So we didn't have, we don't have isolines with resistance and not, but we do have 5 resistant varieties versus 4 susceptible that have a pretty wide spread in yield level. The second thing, obviously, that I've already mentioned to you guys is, we have a problem with stand establishment. And so, there is a really strong correlation between final plant population and yield. And so the question we asked was, should we be breeding for stand establishments? And our hope is that we can solve it with agronomy. So that's what we're going to start with this year. And then embark on breeding for stand establishment. It's a really hard trait to work with because there's so many environmental factors involved. And so it's just not a really straightforward breeding question. So this is a case where maybe it's a breeding target, but we're going to try agronomy first. Another breeding target we were really expecting, predicting to have, is heat tolerance and yield stability. So what we know is peas tend to be grown in the Northwest, where it's dry and actually a lot cooler than it is in the Midwest. You guys in Missouri for sure know how hot and humid it gets in the Midwest. And so what we thought was we might see some variation by environment on our performance for peas. And so what you can see on the right, on the left slide here is on the x-axis is the latitude of our locations at each point, right? So this would be the southernmost location, and over here would be the northernmost location as you move left to right. And then on the y-axis, of course, is yield. And so when you look at the top graph, and it's just the yield values, it sure looks like the plots in the southern latitudes yielded less than the plots in the northern latitudes, and we thought we were onto something. Then we went down to, sort of a just plot yield level to number of reproductive features, which included flowers and pods. And in this case, you sort of lose that trend, right? It starts to break up a bit. But you could still argue that there's maybe a south to north increase in yield. But then when you go down and break it down to number of aborted seeds per pod, you lose that relationship altogether. And so if we assume that heat tolerance and yield stability are a result of, seed abortion, then it looks like that doesn't really, at least last year, it didn't explain the trend that we saw for yield, and that trend may be related more to, fertility or management or planting population than it was to actual heat temperatures. On the right here, I have a longitude plot. It's exactly the same as latitude, only except on the x-axis, you're moving from west to east. And in this case, I think as you move from west to east, you get a little less sun and a little more humidity, right? And in this case, we don't have to go through each plot. There was no trend there. And the one thing I'll say about this data, again, 1 year, I've already admitted that our plots were a bit compromised on stand. So we have this confounding factor. And so, how much do you trust this data that we presented? Nah, I don't know, not very much. But it's kind of a motivation to try it again next year. And the other thing that we're going to do in this next year to try to, besides manage these plots a little bit better, is we're actually going to expand the geography that we're testing in. So we're going to go all the way down into the Delta where it really is hot and humid. They would laugh at you guys in Missouri for the heat and the humidity down in the Delta. And then we're going to move west at a lower latitude, but into some real heat in western Kansas, western Nebraska. So we can really actually test this theory a little better in these upcoming years of experiments. So the next breeding target we have is protein content. And I don't actually have data on this yet. We're trying to fit our NIR line still. The regression line looks a little funky. So it's set up for soybeans and we're working on that right now. So I don't have data on it yet, but we know that this will be a breeding target. So this is, one of the main points of growing peas, right? Short season, high protein. And so higher protein is certainly going to be a breeding target for us. There's a range of protein contents in commercial varieties right now. And then there's an even bigger range, obviously, in the GRIN accessions that have been screened. We think there is going to be an easy phenotype for this. We're just kind of getting it developed, but once we have it, it'll be just a quick, high throughput kind of situation. And we think there's lots of potential for good breeding strategies for this based on soybean work. We think that there is potential to increase protein without damaging yield. So generally those two things tend to be inversely related, but the soybean guys have proven that you can break that relationship to some extent. So, so we're feeling pretty positive that this will be a great breeding target for us. So before I move off peas for grain, I want to just talk a little bit about a winter pea. So the deal with a winter pea is instead of planting in late March, early April, and harvesting in late June, early July, you actually plant in the fall. So you take your crop off and then in sort of mid-September, you plant the winter pea, and like winter wheat, it grows a little bit, then it goes to sleep for the winter and it wakes up in March and it starts to grow again. And you harvest on roughly the same timeline as you would harvest your spring peas. And so the short story on winter peas is that they can do everything that a spring pea can do. The difference is that they provide some of that soil improvement, soil holding benefit of a cover crop. And they really do use that kind of lost season by being there in the field in the late fall and early spring. So one thing I've been amazed by peas is how well they grow in really cold conditions. And these winter peas will really take advantage of their ability to do that growth in what is for us in the Midwest, traditionally an odd time for plant growth. And there's a good potential for a breeding effort here. We have freezing tolerance, genetic information, some QTL. There's good variation in germplasm. And most exciting, we've started a collaboration with Kevin McPhee at Montana State University to develop a winter pea variety together. So this is a picture of the winter pea experiments in Bozeman in 2020. And so you can see there's some variation in how these varieties survived between 2019 and 2020 when they started growing again. And then next to it is actually a spring pea variety next to a winter pea. So you can see there's quite a difference between the spring and winter, and then also difference among the winter. So this is going to be a good breeding target. And then the third picture over is our nursery from last fall. So these are some plots that we had out, and we had a fairly warm December last year. So this picture was taken, I think, like on December 8th. I went out and there were all of our winter pea varieties outgrowing. And then the last picture on this screen is, this is an artificial phenotype for winter hardiness. So everybody knows that the best way and the most surefire way to prove winter hardiness in a crop is to actually put it in the field where you get frost heaving and all of the, kind of variety of environmental conditions that can happen to a crop. But a good way to screen early germplasm is in a freezing chamber. So this is a picture of our first screen and development of a protocol for a freezing screen for winter pea germplasm. So now I'm going to transition talking about grain pea production, right? So the product of both the winter and spring pea that I've talked about so far is a grain that you sell. In this case, the pea is the benefit of it is not the grain, but rather the leaf tissue that turns into nitrogen. And so the goal here with this pea breeding project is to use peas as a cover crop and help us move to a reduced and fully in-season synthetic nitrogen application. So, there's lots of good motivations for reducing synthetic nitrogen production. And then the other advantage to replacing some of that with a pea cover crop is that you get all of those benefits of a cover crop along with the nitrogen, right? So we're thinking of winter peas in this context, maybe spring peas, we don't know. The idea is based on a trial that was run in Massachusetts with fava beans, which are just another legume. So we read that article, we got kind of excited. We tried a small, quick study in Biluco, Chile, in our off-season nurseries, where we planted a pea and rye cover crop and followed it with corn. And this is a picture of the corn growing after the pea and rye cover crop. This is a pea cover crop only, corn growing after a pea cover crop. And then this is a corn crop growing after, just regular normal fertilization. And so what you can see is that the pea doesn't quite get you there as far as of matching the normal fertilization, but it's getting you part of the way for sure, right? So we thought there's potential here. We think this could work. So, so we just put our first trials out last fall and last summer, where we planted peas as a nitrogen source. So I don't have any data to show you on how corn is going to respond because we're going to plant it here in a month. So we're getting ready to really test this idea this year. But the product concept is maybe that you interplant peas in whatever your standing crop is. Oh, sorry, guys. The other product concept is maybe you can plant after harvest, depending on how much growth the winter peas can do in the spring. So these are some questions we're asking. When do you plant? How do you plant? You guys, I'm really sorry. Yeah, when do you plant and how do you plant? And then the other question we have to answer sort of in the agronomic research department is, when is the pea nitrogen available? And when should you apply supplemental nitrogen to complement that? And so this is a theoretical way that this might look, where you plant your corn and you put a starter fertilizer down with it. Then you let the pea nitrogen serve the corn through kind of the early summer. And then sometime in June, you put a side dress application on, and that side dress is what helps the crop finish out. So that's the theory. We've got lots and lots of agronomy research to do to see exactly what that might look like. And one of the things that I'm really curious about is how durable is this system across various soils and weathers, right? Is it going to be very specific? The management, is it going to be very specific to individual farms? So we have lots of questions to answer there. And then from my perspective, the really cool questions have to do with breeding. So how do we breed for peas to best provide nitrogen? And so we know there's some work going on for breeding for winter hardiness and legume cover crops in the public sector. But then, we've also thought about, that's just kind of in-field breeding selection. We've also thought about, more precision phenotyping and what should our goals there be. So some of them are pretty obvious: high biomass, both above and below ground, frost tolerance. But then some get wilder: nodulation rate and stability. And maybe we could even breed for tissue composition differences to fit particular environments. So, so yeah, that's kind of the end. I hope I don't know if I left time for a few questions, but I just want to thank you guys for listening. And I hope I've given you some food for thought on all the different ways that we have to, sort of think differently about plant breeding when we think about it in the context of a cropping system.
Thank you, Dr. Lira, for sharing your novel ideas on introducing the pea crop to the cropping system in the Midwest. Yeah, we have a few questions in the chat. The first question we have is from Bruna, they wanted to ask, do you still plan to use no-till and adapt it for pea, or will there be some tillage involved considering the concepts of carbon sequestration?
Right. So we intend to make this system work in a no-till environment. We will probably characterize it for both a tillage and a no-till environment to give our growers flexibility, but we would not deliver it without a no-till option for exactly the reasons that you're bringing up.
Thank you. Other question we have from Kulbir Sandhu is asking if the seed quality in Iowa was comparable to Montana or Canada. Midwest weather can be unpredictable.
So I think this is hard to do over Zoom, but I wonder what you mean by seed quality. So if you mean the quality of the grain that we harvested, just visually, we sent some samples out to Montana and said, does this look like healthy seed? And they said, yeah, that looks great. There was no molds on it. There was no seed size differences or anything that you'd be worried about with a finished grain product.
There is another question from Bruna. They are asking, would there be financial advantages in using P as a nitrogen source versus only nitrogen fertilizers?
So I think so. I mean, obviously it depends on, and we haven't done the economic research here, but it depends on how much it costs to buy the pea and get them in the ground, right? Both of those things have costs. But if you can not only replace some synthetic nitrogen and save money there, but also get some kind of an ecosystem services payment, then right, there would be financial gain. The reason that people tend not to use green manures these days is because, I mean, there's sort of two reasons. And one is an issue of convenience and reliability. But another reason is that synthetic nitrogen is actually pretty cheap. I mean, everything is expensive on the farm, but it's comparatively cheap. And so we would have to demonstrate something beyond just the nitrogen replacement, I think, as a benefit to using these peas.
I have one question. Since I know that peas are less tolerant to herbicide drift and all that. So right now there is a trend of like early season planting in mid-south or Midwest. Did you face any problems of herbicide drift when you are planting peas along with the other crops that are already like very much resistant to those herbicides?
Yeah, so, I was really worried about this. And oddly, we had only one of our plots that was damaged by herbicide. And I don't think that it was because our plots were particularly well protected. But I do think that maybe our growers were careful. So this is a case where you need to be careful. You need to be careful with your drift. And I know that, the more plots that get out there, and if we get whole farms and lots of them, we'll see this problem. Our perspective right now is that the pea market is going to be a non-traded market. And so, we're not going to have Roundup peas in the short term. And so, this is a real risk that you're bringing up. It's a fair question and something we'll have to just, figure out how to manage.
Thank you, Dr. Lira, for answering the questions and for a wonderful talk. So now it's time to take a lunch break, and we will join back at 12:10 p.m. to attend the lightning talk panel discussion part 1, which will be moderated by our faculty advisor for this symposium committee by Dr. Sherry Flint Garcia. See you all after lunch break. Thank you.